Welcome, you're tuning into another edition of the Asia Gaming Brief face-to-face series. I'm sitting down today with Don Carducci, Equity Research Analyst of JP Morgan Australia, here to talk about some of the recent bids that have been sent towards Crown Resorts' way. Hey Don, welcome back to the face-to-face series. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much to Asia Gaming Brief. Thanks, Felix, for your time, and excited to chat the topic du jour.
Well, there's definitely been quite a lot of action on Crown Resorts' front lately. Just in the last couple of months, we've seen bids come in from Blackstone, from Oaktree, and just last week, the rival casino operator Star Entertainment Group threw their hat into the ring. Everyone seems to want to get a piece of Crown's pie lately. So maybe I just start with some of the most recent news, which was Crown's rejection of the Blackstone bid. I just want to get your thoughts on that. Can you talk us through what the possible thinking was from Crown's side?
I think it was really interesting that Crown decided to reject the Blackstone bid because they also have this interesting situation where they have multiple suitors. I think that the two front runners, if you will, would be Blackstone and Star. Of course, you have Oaktree in the background providing a little bit of pressure as well. But what you have Crown doing is playing a very interesting poker face. They're releasing ASX announcements last Monday to say, no to Blackstone. We've gotten this thing from Star. And oh, hey, by the way, we've appointed a new CEO that happens to be from Lend-Lease. And everyone's trying to extract value in this PropCo, OpCo. And that's kind of right up his alley. So I think that Crown is playing a much smarter game than this under pressure, distressed company that has to do something before the sky falls down on them. So it's very interesting what they've done, and I think that they're being very smart, and there's probably more to play to this story.
So do you think in this poker scenario is Crown bluffing, or do they feel like there's going to be some better bids coming through?
Well, if you think back to the first Blackstone bid, so there were kind of three, you call them issues at the time. The stock was trading below the $10 mark. I think it was around $9.89, $9.90. That was kind of issue one, was the share price was underpriced. The second issue was ILGA, was the New South Wales inquiry by the Independent Liquor and Gaming Authority. And then the third one was the Royal Commission. So if you think about those three issues as they were back then, they've really changed up to today. So the share price is trading 30% up from that. ILGA has basically last week said that you folks are going to start paying the New South Wales casino levy. So right off the bat, you have a share price fixed and ILGA saying, look, you're going to be able to gamble in Barangaroo. And it's almost become much of a muchness to where, is it a day, is it a week, a month, a year? I think it's safe to say it's somewhere in between, that day and the year, closer towards maybe the end of the year, calendar year. But the not having a license in Barangaroo issue is probably not going to be that big of one anymore. And then in terms of the Royal Commissions, we should have a pretty good pre-look into the interim report in the next month and a half. So that's where the timing of all this is very interesting, because previously when people were saying you really need to get this sorted out before Barangaroo becomes a bigger issue, it's no longer an issue. So I think that right now the question and a lot of this corporate activity around, does Crown actually need to do a deal? Do they have to sell assets, or do they have to sell PropCo, OpCo? Why don't they just do it themselves? They just announced a CEO who's the ex-Lend-Lease CEO, who, for all intents and purposes, could probably just do it for them themselves, and they don't necessarily need someone to save the day if the day doesn't.
So do you think Blackstone's out of it, or are they going to come back with yet another revised proposal?
That's where the biggest gift to Crown so far has been Star already in bidding for this asset. So Crown's been able to say to Blackstone, that's not enough. And then, hey, Star, we need more information. And I don't know what more information they would need. Of course, that's between Crown and Star. But if there's one way to get someone to increase their price for a fourth time, because it was $11.85, $12, and now $12.35, they kind of have to come through with a fourth and final. So they know that there's a competitive tension, and Crown has even said, we want a little bit more information from Star. So they haven't outright rejected both. They've really played, this one seems a little bit more favorable because the folks over there are saying that, well, our share price is worth north of $14 in a couple of years' time. So, of course, $13 is where it's trading now. if we reject the Blackstone bid outright, will the share price fall below what Blackstone is offering? I don't think so. I think the market is pricing Crown in as in play, if you will.
And just, I do definitely want to ask you more about Star's bid, but just quickly on Oaktree, because they don't seem to have made any kind of decision on Oaktree as of yet. So, but that was not seen as a particularly enticing deal for Crown. So, what's your thoughts on Oaktree? Is that basically zero chance?
It was funny because I read the announcement and did a little bit of work on it, and I actually didn't know what Oaktree was getting out of it. So I knew what they were offering, but they didn't really say what their intent was or what the long-term, end game for them was. Now, presumably where, they were thinking is that they were going to have some type of an option to purchase at a later date at a set price. But it probably would have created this probity issue, which is where it's been very interesting to see what the ILG chair has said in reference to Blackstone's view on the third quarter of probity. I thought that was a really interesting tug of war around the communication for does it happen, when does it happen, we've already started it or not. But the Oaktree bid does not seem to be getting, to your point, nearly as much airtime as the other ones. Because I think the structure of the deal was perhaps a bit more opaque than just saying, here's 1235 or here's a merge co, prop co, op co situation.
Like I said, definitely want to ask you about Star. Obviously, you mentioned that Crown's asked for more information from Star. We don't know what information that is, but it is a sign that at least they're considering it. So, in your opinion, does this deal have a good chance of coming through?
I don't think that it does. And the reason why I don't think a transaction will eventuate is because I think it's very interesting when you think about Crown's response. Because if you think about when Star would have given them the bid on a Friday night, post-market, or maybe even a Saturday, the Crown board would have gotten together. They would have had time to think about it. And yet they went forward with making the announcement on Monday that this is our new CEO. He has a $5.2 million golden parachute. He just so happens to be from Lend-Lease, and everyone who's talking about this REIT deal thing, we're just putting a guy at the helm that can do it for us, knowing full well that back in 2016, they floated a REIT IPO as something to extract value from the assets. So I think that it's really interesting also when you think about Barangaroo and basically the bidder, so Blackstone, they own, call it 9.99. There have been a few other folks on the register that have been vocal in the press that Crown does need to conduct a transaction. So just based on Blackstone's ownership and the other fund managers' ownership, they can get the deal done. There's just that Consolidated Press Holdings, CPH, who's saying no. Because if they had said yes, then the deal would have been done. And so that's where I'm putting together the pieces that Crown is installing this REIT gentleman as the CEO, which might be a little bit of pressure on everyone that there's no certainty that there'll be a transaction. But my point on CPH not being necessarily a seller is to say that, Barangaroo has been in the works for years. And I can almost, state with certainty that when Barangaroo does open up, or when New South Wales does grant Barangaroo that license to operate in New South Wales, the share price should react very positively to that. So that being said, why wouldn't you just wait until Barangaroo opens up in the next, 3, 4, 5 months, and then say, okay, now if you want to bid, we're a little bit more clear line of sight into how Barangaroo will operate and what the market looks like in New South Wales. So I don't necessarily think that, even though Star is providing some tension on Blackstone's bid, I don't necessarily think that Crown is in a hurry to do something that they don't necessarily have to do. And of course, there's always been a bit of a not mismatch, but a bit of a premium to Crown on a PE basis, trading relative to Star, because the brand is seen as a bit premium. So does Crown want to dilute their brand down to Star, or would Star be much happier, I think, combining with Crown? I think the latter makes a little bit more sense, but the former kind of makes me scratch my head and say, why does Crown feel like they have to if they don't necessarily want to?
I wanted to ask you because I haven't seen much data or any information about this, but JobKeeper for Australia had ended earlier in March. And for a while, that was giving some people quite a lot of extra disposable income to play with. And, that was being referenced as something that might have caused an uptick in gaming revenues at the time. But now that it's gone, how have you seen that affecting gaming revenues across the nation?
It's a great question. That's where it's interesting because Tabcorp generally reports a trading update right around quarterly conference right around this period, but they haven't this year. And I think the reason behind that is because you'd be able to triangulate based on what the February trading was to date, but then more importantly, what post JobKeeper was into the August result, being June year end, right? So I think that that's where the companies who have been the most affected by it have been a bit more silent. And since post JobKeeper, I think wagering turnover has probably been impacted greater than people's expectations by about 7 to 10% worse than what most folks had planned for in terms of deterioration. I mean, I think the one thing that is still working in favor, though, would be the borders. The borders are still closed, so you have a very captive audience. And that was what was really interesting about the Star proposal to Crown was that at the same time that you're bidding for Crown, you're talking about how you're doing so well domestically. And so some could say that, why would you talk about how strong things are when the borders are shut when you're bidding for a company that's supposed to be kind of in need of a helping hand? Because it just shows that the city domestic market is actually going quite well for Star. At the same time, had the market not been told how well Sydney was doing, I think there would have been a concern that Star sees no growth, therefore they've got to buy to grow. So a bit of a double-edged sword there, but it's interesting to bid for a casino and then say how well you're doing when the reality of it is every casino should probably be doing quite well, which is what I think. However, wagering on the other hand, which is what I had mentioned prior, I think that that's probably what's most levered to JobKeeper and has come off a significant chunk.
I did want to also ask you about what happens when those borders reopen, and I guess the timelines for that keep shifting back. But eventually, at some point, international people, they'll start coming back, and Australians will be able to start leaving and going on holidays. How's that going to affect gaming revenue? And I think you touched on it a little bit, but could you expand on that a little bit if you could?
Yeah, so there's two things that I think the analysts across the market are kind of scratching their head right now thinking about. One is, with almost the near certain death of junkets nationwide, you would have seen that Crown and Star both said no more junkets for VIP in New South Wales. That's one of them, and most likely the WA and Victorian Royal Commissions will come out with a recommendation similar. They might touch a little bit on board representation for casinos and licenses and shareholder caps, et cetera, but presumably there will not be much offshore junket. There won't be any of those trips. And what that will do, and it's tied to the second point, which is digital. It's cashless, it's cardless, it's gambling on a card that is potentially tied to a name with a financial institution that's triangulated who you are and what you're doing, and maybe an ABN. There's a lot of things, a lot of questions and implementation that has to go into that. But I guess the way that I think about it, and it's a bit interesting if it might work this way, but people who are dealing with cash versus credit cards, if you have a pre-limit on a gaming card or account, it's no different than almost setting a limit on your credit card. And of course, everyone's different in setting their limits on credit cards, which is why I'd say everyone's going to be different on setting their limits on gambling cards. And if you gave a teenager a $100 bill and said, don't spend more than this, they're probably not going to spend more than that because they can't. But if you gave someone a credit card and they had, a $500 limit on it, but they shouldn't spend more than $100, what's the risk that they spend a little bit more? And that's where, digital actually might come to bite some of the anti-gaming lobbies. It's good from a tracking perspective, but it's actually a bit easier to, I think, lose yourself in not touching the actual physical money and appreciating a 20, a 50, 100 into a slot machine. So that's one aspect. And then the first aspect was was what happens with international, which, to answer your question, I think that there'll still be significant direct premium. So there'll still be an appetite for folks who are visiting from Asia and all over the world. When you do get into a city, you can go to a casino or an integrated resort that has a great hotel, great restaurants, great entertainment, and that offer will still be there. So the junket revenue, that is coming off a lot, and that was a significant part of VIP turnover, but the premium direct will still be there. And we know from Star's communication that they had been trying to diversify more towards that segment anyway for quite a few years. So I don't think it's the death of VIP, but it's definitely a big speed bump.
All right. Well, Don, thank you so much for your time today. Brilliant to speak to you as always, and hope to have you on again soon.
Well, thanks so much to Asia Gaming Brief. Really appreciate all that you folks do. Thanks so much, Felix, and looking forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks again for joining Asia Gaming Brief's Face-to-Face series. Join us every Friday as we speak to some of the industry's leading decision makers and influencers.